It might strike Americans off guard, but all across the Baltics you have monuments to the Waffen SS, who served both the Germans and their national homeland here in the Baltics. Now, this is at the Museum for Fight for Estonia's Freedom, kind of an unusual name for a museum, but it depicts a soldier of the 20th Waffen SS, or the 1st Estonian Division, which were local soldiers, not Germanic soldiers, because all of the Germans were shipped over to reclaimed territory, the Nazis called it. These were local men, led by local commanders like Alfrons Rebane, who is a fascinating character. I didn't really get the chance to explore much about his history, but this is some footage of their activities on the Eastern Front. The plaque, by the way, reads, "To the Estonian men who fought against Bolshevism in 1940 to 1945 and for the restoration of Estonian independence." And right in front of this Waffen SS monument is a statue to Rhein Helm, whose family is very influential in conservative politics. See, his older brother, Mart, was the Minister of Interior from 2019 to 2020 and the chairman of the Conservative People's Party of Estonia until 2020, when he was succeeded by his son, Martin. And the Helm family actually seems to be pretty involved with maintaining this museum. This is, I'm terrible at military equipment, but I believe that's an old MiG, and they've just got these things lying around. Old shells, old vehicles, tanks from different periods of Estonian history, and this is all at the same museum, just lying out in the open. When I pulled up, it was just kind of off a dirt road, and they waved me in and said, "Oh, enjoy the museum." So there were, from what I could see, a few security cameras, but all of this was kind of just out in the open. This is a T-34, and it says on the side, "For Soviet Estonia." Here are some old, what look like German and Soviet helmets. And it was raining pretty heavily that day. It looked actually like a Ukrainian flag on the left there, and that's just the flag on the right of the region, but this is all video monitored because there's a lot of valuable things, and some of this was very heavily centered around Finland. Oh, that's White Death on the right. Recognize him, Samuel Haya. And the Museum for the Fight for Estonia's Freedom is also very interested in the Finnish War. You can see the invasion of Finland there, and Finnish snipers. That must have been tough. Off to the side of the main area, with monuments to the German and Estonian defense of the Tannenberg line and Narva, is this monument, which is a little bit controversial because it commemorates the Estonian, Norwegian, Danish, Swedish, Belgian, and Dutch volunteers of the German 3rd SS Panzer Corps who died between 1943 and 1945. And these actually look like buckshot. I wonder if somebody came in. I wonder when this monument was actually created, because someone clearly fired buckshot into it. I was very surprised to see Obergruppenführer Felix Steiner's name actually mentioned on the monument, who was the commander of this new corps formed April 1943 as a headquarters for the Viking Division and Nordland Division, which were foreign volunteers, enthusiastic opponents of communism. Some of their first actions were fighting Yugoslav partisans, but then they had to retreat after the Battle of the Narva bridgehead, going to the Courland Pocket and eventually being transferred to the Oder Front. I hope you can see these fortifications well enough. Over here you've got a divot in the ground and what seems to be a bit of a nest right here. And another, what looks to be a machine gun nest right over here. This is right on the ocean front at the very beginning of the Tannenberg line. And beginning in February, going until August of 1944, the German Army Detachment Narva and the Soviet Leningrad Front fought in the Narva offensive. This was a German strategic victory, but by September of 1944, the Finnish military signed an armistice agreement with the Soviet Union, which gave them access to Estonian waters. And only weeks later, there was a massive evacuation of the Germans in this area, as the Soviets moved into Riga. They evacuated from Estonia. And this is at the memorial complex for the Battle of the Tannenberg Line. The first wooden cross was erected here in 1994, followed by this one, a large metal one, in 1999. It reads, "The Estonian people mourn the sons of the homeland who died in the battle for the defense of Estonia." During the initial unveiling, veterans from both the German and Russian sides were invited, and the monument was never intended to promote any specific ideology. In 2004, though, a memorial stone here was erected in honor of the veterans of the 20th SS Grenadier Division, which suffered many casualties here. Every year, a few veterans show up to the anniversary, which is important because the 20th was composed almost entirely of Estonians. In 2006, a new stone was added to commemorate Dutch and Walloon volunteers who joined with the Germans. Vandalism has occurred several times, mostly acts committed by ethnic Russians, who make up a sizable minority here in Estonia. In memory of the fallen and missing Dutch front soldiers, nurses, and helpers who died in captivity and who died in World War II in Eastern Europe, 1941 to 1945, faithfully fulfilling their duty. And this is a monument to the Walloon Legion, which recruited from collaborators in Belgium. And what's so fascinating is that this legion was commanded by a man by the name of Leon de Grelle. It says here, to mourn the fallen. And de Grelle was in exile until 1994 when he died, but he was sentenced to death in his absence. And in the meantime, after the war, thousands of them surrendered in German-occupied Norway so they wouldn't fall into Eastern European hands and end up in the gulags. This German war cemetery is on the Estonian side of the Narva River, and if you look over it, you can see the very nice country homes inside of Russia, because this is sort of the resort area of Russia. And obviously it looks nothing like what you'd see a little bit further south and a little bit further east. This cemetery was created by the German army in Narva in 1943, basically overlooking the Russian border. And in 1999, it was made to include all of the fallen of the Narva front. So there are 4,000 buried here today, with room for 15,000 more. And the monument to the Battle of Tannenberg Line, which is nowadays so controversial, is right over there, but in its shadow is a Soviet mass grave. And in this cemetery you can find two mass graves. One has only 25 Soviets, but another has 40,000 who died in the fighting between July 25th and August 10th of 1944. In that amount of time, 40,000 men lost their lives. And the old Soviet mass grave of 40,000 people is on this side of the road, but over here is the old cemetery that they built across from. And because the trenches were set up in a cemetery, the ground was not really disturbed for farming or hiking or anything, so you can now see trenches and even bullet holes in the old graves and metal markers. And these are what undisturbed trenches look like nowadays. You can see the line which kind of snakes through here. It looks like something blew right through here. And just imagine how ominous it was to be fighting essentially just in a graveyard. You can see two holes for basically fighting. We're getting swarmed by mosquitoes, so sorry if the camera lurches a little bit. They go right for your fingers out here, and I've never seen that happen elsewhere. And a trench runs right through here. And you can see what's probably a crater. And we're looking for holes inside of these crosses because that would show a bullet went through it, but I think that these are made of pig metal, meaning once a bullet hits it, it pretty much just chips off, and most of these are chipped. And in the center of all the fighting, Constantine Baron von Korff. And an old mausoleum off to the side in the same cemetery that was absolutely destroyed during the battle. And like I said earlier, this might be very jarring for Americans who don't have any kind of conception of how Eastern Europeans view World War II, but this gentleman was wearing a black polo shirt with a Totenkopf insignia on his chest, and on his left sleeve there, he's got the insignia of the 20th Panzer Corps Division, or the 1st Estonian, the local volunteer unit of Waffen SS. Rather than take a die-hard attitude towards us, he seemed to smile. He threw his arm up and said Heil Hitler, and we kind of awkwardly just looked at him. I didn't want to do it back, of course, but then he walked into the shop and he paid for our entrance to the museum. And he then told us that his grandfather, who died in the late 1980s, had served with the Waffen SS there in Estonia. And as we walk around, we can see some of the monuments to the fallen here, and it makes me think that the monument we saw at the very beginning of this video to the 3rd Panzer Corps was made by the same guys. These are slabs of black stone, but these are, you might say, a little more incendiary, and they're right out in front of the museum, so they can very clearly be seen, and there won't be any buckshot impacting them. So the first one is Regiment Norge. These were volunteers from Denmark and Norway for the Waffen SS. They served in Croatia, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Pomerania, and then finally in Berlin. And at the bottom it says, "In memory of the fallen." The next monument of the three are the Danish volunteers that served in many of the same places, and the final epitaph says, "To commemorate our mission." And finally, the last monument is to the Flemish soldiers who rest here. Fascinating. The Flemish were especially fierce fighters during World War II. German monuments. Flemish soldiers. Alfrons Rebane was born in 1908 a few miles south of here, but from 36 to 39, he was a low-ranking officer that lived in this building at the main roundabout in the rural village of Mustla in southern Estonia. And the reason he has a controversial reputation is because he was a lieutenant in the Estonian army when they were independent, before the Soviets or the Germans had invaded. However, in 1940, when the Soviet Union invaded Estonia, their first order of business was to execute all of the upper-ranking officers and let men like Alfrons Rebane, who was relatively low in the power structure, to their own devices. However, he could expect, and his veteran friends could expect, to be detained and arbitrarily sent off to the gulags at any point in time. So a lot of his compatriots went off into the swamps and forests and created the Forest Brothers movement. And this was before the Germans ever set foot on Estonian soil. Now, when they did get there, they told men like Alfrons Rebane, you can join the regular army, the Wehrmacht, and fight against the Soviet Union. Your fight isn't for the Germans, your fight is against the Soviets. And overlooking his house, coincidentally, is this monument to the Estonian War of Independence that was there before the Soviets even got there in 1940, obviously only re-erected after the fall of the Iron Curtain. And again, that is Alfrons Rebane's house. Now, because of his leadership in the Wehrmacht, the Germans made an offer he couldn't refuse and told him he was now in command of the Estonian units of the SS. He took this position pretty reluctantly. And after the war, he continued fighting an insurgency, working in London for MI6, British military intelligence, and even evacuating the leader of the civil government back to Germany. And this is downtown Mustla. During World War II, the Germans used the central burial plot at the Tartu Cemetery as a sort of military memorial to their fallen soldiers. Once the Red Army turned the tide and reoccupied the area, these graves were buried over and the headstones destroyed. But beginning in 1964, new bodies that were found in Estonia were buried here. And more recently, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, the names of anyone who could be identified were included here and are upkept by the German War Graves Commission. And there are the Russians looking right back at us. They've got a radar dome up there. Big fence. 2 buoys. 1 green, 1 red. So when Estonia became independent in 1920, there was a treaty between them and the Soviet Union. And the Soviets agreed to recognize their right to essentially all of what was Seto territory, or Setoma, and that included the area just beyond this lake, and especially the heart of Setoma, which was considered the Pskov Monastery. They are an Orthodox people. In fact, the village that we're in right now, this viewing tower, is majority Russian, and it's a fishing village. But apparently on a clear day, if you look over this lake, you can see the glinting of the onion domes. And this is Jumalamagi, or God's Hill. And you can see some stones up in that grove of trees. It's important when you visit here to be incredibly respectful. And if you have something, to leave an offering. And don't ask for a wish that is too much for the offering you left, something small. But this is where, according to their myths and legends, the god king Peko, or Pico, when you die, your soul comes to this hill, and it waits for him to come down with a handcart, and he loads the souls into his handcart and brings you to heaven. And this is a belief that was nearly fading up until the early 2000s, almost unknown to the outside world, but Setoma declared itself a kingdom to sort of get widespread public recognition and gain the attraction of tourists. And now they have many museums and history articles online, and they were very famous in National Geographic for a while. And it's such a fascinating place, so close to Russia. And these rocks are all around. I saw some in the wood line just to our right over the road, and those woods. But I believe from Google Earth I saw the statue up here. Before we reach it, I'll just show you some of the interesting boulders. From what I understand, the local Orthodox priests are totally fine with this, and in fact, they sort of see it as a blending of the two religions. I'll tell you a little bit more about it from the tower overlooking the Seto territory. And a perfect example of how the Seto people are able to blend paganism with Christianity, you can see on top of God's Hill, there's a stone altar that is where the god Seto would come down to collect souls to bring to heaven, and yet on top of it, you've got a Christian cross. Now, the story here goes back to the time of the Crusades and the Novgorod Republic. So during this time, because they were so close to Russia, the Seto were able to disassociate themselves from the Teutonic Knights and associate themselves more closely with Novgorod. And because they tolerated pagan practice in Novgorod, even though the Seto people were kind of on the outskirts of that civilization, they managed to stay in touch with their roots. And then, when it became more of a Russian Orthodox state, they managed to basically meld the two pretty perfectly. And the priests, at least from what I've been told, were not too displeased at it. Obviously, it wasn't encouraged, but it was something they absolutely tolerated. And I would love to know what some of these symbols mean. And I would also love to hear from you if you know anything more about this. I feel like I've probably gotten half the story wrong here, and I'd love to hear the truth. And that's Russia. Look how close we are to it. That's enough Russia for today. I think I'll go back home. And here you've got some of the old collective farms and factories in the center of Obenitsa. And in front of this old building from the 1930s in Obenitsa, you've got these flags of Uralic Turkic peoples here that I find really beautiful. Right next to the old sauna, opened up in the 1960s, and you can see the brick on the side in traditional Setoma pattern. And this is the Singing Mother, the monument to the singing mothers of Obenitsa village, specifically to Hilana Tarka, who really opened up the eyes of the world to the practice of Piko, a sort of unique blend of shamanism and orthodoxy practiced among the Setoma people. And she's looking in the direction of Russia across the lake here, the Obenitsa Reservoir. And the flag of Setoma is right there. And after the fall of the Soviet Union, many of these communities were cut off from basically half of their trade and commerce. You can see Russia is literally right over there, and we're going to be passing within meters of it on the way to the main church. And the Rock House Art Gallery over there was established, or built rather, in 1933. Such a beautiful old building. And there's a lake and statue of Mother Earth right over there.